Hello again, Richard. Here we are again.
Morning, Becky. How are you?
I'm all right, actually. Yeah, it's not bad. I'm very excited to talk about on-site BNG, obviously.
Okay,
So,
brilliant. Well, shall we start by saying today is the 6th of February, so our kind of materials are current on that date. Can you, how have we got here? Like, why are we talking about this thing?
yeah, so we got asked. So we are part of a Future Homes Hub group. So the Future Homes Hub kind of work with housing developers, particularly sort of SMEs, to try and help them. And they've got a project on BNG. And part of that sort of liaison group, which they've got with a variety of stakeholders, it came up that defining significant on-site gains was an issue, and that was across developers, and we knew that it had been raised by local authorities. And there was lots of sort of tumbleweed blowing around when someone said, oh, we could do with some extra work on this. So we, as PAS, ended up saying, okay, we'll have a look at it. So we started out from the position of looking at, right, what so it's up to the LPA to determine significant on-site. What does that mean? So we'll talk that through. But what we kind of got to in the end, talking it with LPA folk, but also actually with some developer ecologists, which was really useful, was, wait a minute, it's kind of dived in too soon into that particular issue when there's a wider issue about how do you think about on-site BNG. So we've ended up calling it just generally, what do you want to do about on-site BNG? So hopefully that's helpful. We do talk about the significant issue, but we feel just focusing on that is not necessarily that. You need to think beyond that, basically, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. So yeah.
Significant in context.
Yes, exactly. So that's it. Yeah. So I guess the questions we are asking, the main question was asking, what do you want to do about on-site BNG? So obviously there's this situation where on-site is meant to be first in terms of the sort of biodiversity gain hierarchy. So developers are meant to demonstrate that if they go off-site, they can't do the on-site. So what do you want to ask for at planning application stage? What do you want to know then? How much information do you need? And then there's this question of, do you want to secure it? Do you want to secure its maintenance? And do you want a separate condition to do that? Or do you want to use the Section 106? But what are you actually securing? Are you securing management, maintenance? What about monitoring and reporting? So for each of these, we've tried to go through, right, what are the legal requirements? What does it say in kind of policy and guidance? And, might you want to go beyond those legal requirements? Because we think in a lot of cases, as we've kind of said in our other session around sort of DM more generally, we think you probably will. Yeah, so that's kind of what we're going to cover.
And spoiler alert, do we have all the answers?
No, we don't, I'm afraid, Rich, sadly. No. So I started out with this slide going, what's legally required? And then a little bit towards the end, I went, oh, I don't really know. So there are a few questions that we have asked of others, and we're hoping to get replies.
And in the short term, we're just going to rely on common sense, aren't we?
Exactly. Always the best. Yeah. So this sort of looks a bit because it's like lots of yellow highlighting, but essentially I've copied some bits from the PPG, the biodiversity net gain PPG. So that's what that yellow highlighting is. I think the important thing to bear in mind is that by design, BNG is a post-consent matter. So you don't get all the information until after consent, and actually the developer cannot submit it until a day after they've had planning permission, the biodiversity gain plan, which has the information in. At planning application stage, actually legally, in terms of the sort of statutory instruments and everything that bring in BNG, the applicant doesn't have to submit anything about what they're doing post-development, so they only have to do a baseline. But it's very likely that you will need some information, need some information about what they're proposing on site for most planning applications. And actually, there's a lot of stuff in the PPG about this that says, so I've highlighted those bits. So there's, you may also seek further information. You may want to work out whether the general biodiversity gain condition is capable of being discharged. You probably want to impose conditions and Section 106 obligations to secure significant on-site BNG. So, and also you might want to ask for further information beyond the minimum information required. So, yeah, so I guess we've got quite a lot of sort of policy guidance support for going above and beyond.
when we talk to developers, they say, well, of course we want to know what
Yeah.
happens afterwards. Like, how
Yeah.
how on earth could we enter into this if we didn't already know?
Yeah, they don't want to suddenly have a surprise Section 106 post consent that suddenly sets out they've got to do a load of stuff on site. So no, and they want to understand the cost. So yeah, exactly. So this is very much not just sort of seen from the LPA perspective. It's definitely, it kind of makes a lot of sense from their perspective as well. Okay, so if you want to go beyond those legal minimum requirements, I guess an important thing to think about is whether you want to update your local validation list. And that is to determine whether there's this whole question about this biodiversity net gain being a significant gain, which we can cover a little bit, but it's just really to understand a bit more about what's going on site. So things you might want to think about is, as well as having that metric calculation for the baseline, do you want some post-development calculations for on-site BNG? Plans for what they're actually going to do, what's it going to look like? And perhaps a bit of a statement of how they're meeting this objective. So how are they going to get to 10%? And are they going to do that with a bit of off-site, a bit of on-site? How have they applied this hierarchy? And one of the things we talked to the developer, so we were talking to developer ecologists from big developers, and they were like, well, we probably want to provide this information to the LPA to make it easy for them, and particularly around this significant on-site biodiversity net gain, because we were talking about how you determine it's significant, and we've got some information around the sort of thinking around that, which you can look at in the annex if you're interested. But they were saying, well, actually, it's quite difficult to pull that out of the metric, and we should make it easy by pulling it out and going, this is a statement of what we think is the case. So, you might want to do that maybe just for majors, but perhaps for some other types of applications. So you can think about that. And that seems to be something that developers would support, definitely for those bigger applications at least. So that you need to think about. I guess you probably won't have that to start with, but I guess we've got majors coming in first. So hopefully by April, you can maybe sort something out on this side of things. And we will obviously share examples of local validation lists. We know that folk are looking at that already, good examples. So then you get into, right, if the applicant hasn't provided that information, what do you do? Is the application invalid, or should you refuse it, or should you ask for further information? What do you want to do? And is it actually fair to expect something? So, I mean, does it really matter? Or is it very, very uncertain because it's phased, for example, or something? And I think that is really important, because that is why the legislation's been written in the way it is, which seems completely counterproductive. But there are certain cases where you just can't provide this information up front. They're probably, in the well, they will be in the minority, but you need to think about that. So
can I just a couple of points there then? So
yeah,
I think you're right. I think the point somewhere in the middle of that, it's the point about it doesn't have to be perfect to be useful, because what you're after is the intention.
Yeah.
Because it might be, stuff changes, stuff comes to light, but you want to know what their intention is.
Yeah.
And this other thing I've heard coming up a bit more now as people are kind of working their way through it is the difference or the similarities between the hump and the lump.
Yes. Yeah.
And we're just going to have to work that out a little bit, aren't we?
Yeah, and I mean, we come on to it a bit later when we talk about management and monitoring, but I don't think that the hump is legally required. I think it might be for the offsite, but I think for onsite, I'm not sure it is, and we're trying to get to the bottom of that. But then, obviously, with a big site, you'd have a lump. So is the hump part of the lump? Because it doesn't make sense if it's not. So yeah, and I think again, it's that sort of pragmatism. It's not being too finicky about it, because in the end, if you've got a good landscaping plan that includes biodiversity, does it matter if it's not an official hump? Probably not.
Well, I think that's also again, from the conversation with developers, for them it's about who ends up actually doing the work.
Yeah.
And if it's kind of generalist, well, it might be better off in the LEMP. And if it's specialist and requires, ecologists with their funny voices and hats and things, then it might end up being
Sandals.
in the safety sandals, obviously.
Yeah.
If there's any cutting to be done.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's it. It's bearing, and I think this is it in the end with all of these slides. You'll see there's quite a lot of like, oh, think about this. There's not necessarily a definitive yes or no answer, because it will be case by case, and we'll kind of be feeling our way a little bit to start with, and then probably over time we'll get a bit more like, oh yes, definitely in this circumstance this is what you do, and no, definitely in that circumstance this is what, that sort of thing. But at the moment we're still trying to figure it out. So yeah,
Hence, I think just to sort of draw that to a kind of, yes, local validation list, but
yes,
no, like definitive, you must do this, and this, and it must all be perfect. It's more
yeah,
about, can you explain what your intentions are
yeah,
so that we can understand, if all things being equal, where you're going to end up.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely. Cool. Okay, so right, we now get to the stage where you don't have enough information. So what do you do? Or you don't have information on site BNG at that stage. So what should you do? So I think it's important to sort of start thinking about whether you actually want to say it's not valid or should be refused. Because, I mean, do you think it's likely that it will provide some BNG on site? Is it a really small development? What type of development is it? Is it already mostly hard standing and they're building some more buildings? What is it? What's the baseline of that? What are you starting from? Is it important to start with? Um, you know, then is it likely that you want to secure it through a conditional section 106? If
Mm.
not, do you really need that information now? You can see, we'll talk about that in a minute, but um,
Because
can
you'll
you
have a
meet,
plan, won't you?
uh, well,
You have a site
I mean,
plan.
you'll have a plan for as part of the planning application.
Mm.
Yeah, you won't necessarily have. I mean, that's it. Yeah, yeah, exactly. You will have some kind of plan to understand. Well, what are they building where? Unless it's very, very outliney, in which case that's a technical planning term there, outliney.
Like it.
Yeah, so I think that's it. Uh, yeah, you've got a bit of an idea of what they're putting on there and whether they've got any space for on-site BNG or just a tiny bit, and then you get into, well, if there's just a tiny bit, are you wanting to do it with a conditional section 106?
Mm.
There is this sort of wider thing around, can they meet the BNG objective? Can they meet 10%? It says some stuff about this in the PPG, which is worth looking at. But I think you need to bear in mind that they can always go to national credits as a last resort. So it's going to be quite difficult to say you can't do 10% because they've always got that option. Yes,
Yep.
it's very expensive, but yeah. But yeah, just really think about, what type of development is it? How big is it? Is it worth bothering with? Is it worth potentially, getting into a bit of a tussle and them appealing against refusal, etc. Yeah, so if you decide, yeah, I think we're going to want to secure this. So you can obviously say it's not valid, you need something, probably like heads of terms for a section 106 or similar, or you can ask for further information or refuse it. Now, BNG on this is not, it's the same as anything else. What would you normally do if you didn't have enough information at planning application stage? Would you normally just ask for further information? Would you refuse it? Think about how concerned you are about being challenged going to appeal, and also the type or size of development, but obviously also think about what you've got in local policy, your local list, because if you're relying on that for a refusal, you need to be a little bit careful if you haven't got anything that goes above and beyond the legal minimum, I would say. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, but we have sort of started off on a slightly negative tip, haven't we? Because probably this isn't
It's
going.
too early in the morning for me,
This
Rich. You
isn't
should
really.
know that.
This
If it
doesn't
was in the
suit.
afternoon, I'd be positive.
This doesn't suit the developer. Doesn't suit the LPA. It
No,
might occasionally happen if people don't really understand what's going
yeah,
on, or are just setting out to be awkward because they're just awkward and going to be awkward about everything the whole way
yeah,
through.
yeah.
So if you're like, this shouldn't happen very often, should it?
No, and I think we're still thinking, we've got this difference between majors coming in very soon from where we are now, and then the minors coming in later in April. And I think for we'd be quite surprised if this came in for majors unless they were a bit of an awkward bugger, basically.
Mm.
And there'd probably be other reasons why you might be thinking about, that you don't want to validate it, you don't want to, so yeah, exactly. Cool. Okay. So, right. So we've now gone, yeah, we've decided we want to secure it. We've got all the information we want. So we've kind of gone through that process. So that's assuming you got the information you need on site. Right. No, sorry, you haven't decided you want to secure it. Sorry. You've got all the information you want. You now got to decide, right, do I bother wanting to secure it via a conditional 106? Now, I think before you decide whether to use a conditional 106, section 106, you need to just think about whether you actually want to secure it and what that means. So this is when we get into this sort of significant increase point, which is under the Environment Act, if the LPA considers that it's a significant increase in the BNG from the baseline, they have to secure its maintenance for 30 years, and that's via a condition, a Section 106, or a conservation covenant. So we've got some more information in the kind of legislation and current guidance on that at the moment. I think the key points, so you can look at that separately. We're not going to sort of cover it in detail, but we have done quite a lot of thinking about this because this is where we started from. And we've talked to quite a few people. I think the key thing is it's about the gain. It's not about whether the habitat itself is significant or important.
Yep.
And it's up to you. It's in the legislation, in that sort of act, that top act, it says it's up to the LPA to define and also to decide how to secure its maintenance. But it's a 30-year commitment. That's a really long time. It needs to be thought about, proportionately. But because it's your decision, that allows you to be a bit flexible and allows you to be a bit pragmatic. So again, we've done some thinking about this and what you need to think about, is it significant? So you can have a look at that.
I think I'm going to ask you about Annex 2. I don't think I'm going to let you get away with that going. We've worked it out and the answer's in the appendix.
Okay, cool. Well, we can talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that where we got to when we were thinking about this significant was, I think there's been a bit of an assumption that if it's not significant, the gain, you don't need to secure it. But actually, it doesn't mean the habitat is a low importance or value. And this is where it's got really confusing because people have been talking about the habitat being significant.
Yeah. They conflate the two, don't they?
Yeah. And actually, there's quite a lot of reasons why you might want to secure it for 30 years or maybe more or less. And there's also like what's already on the site, because actually, if you just think about the gain, if you've got some really lovely, important habitats on site that the developer's done a really amazing job of avoiding and, like they're meant to with the mitigation hierarchy, well, you want to make sure they're going to be okay, don't you? So I think it's really, so this is where we kind of got to when we were thinking it all through and going, well, actually, just focusing on that significant is not, it's actually, do you want to secure the on-site BNG?
Focusing on the gain only rather than the habitat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there are various reasons there why you might want to. So, there are other pieces of legislation that come in as well. So things like the habitats regulations, protected species, EIA, but also you might use the urban greening factor. You might have green infrastructure requirements or open space requirements and all of these, and policy requirements. So, just because it's not a significant gain doesn't mean you don't need to secure it. But obviously you'll have to justify that and, in negotiations with the developer. So again, think about that. Do you want to zip to Annex 2 very quickly to just show that?
You know what? Let's go through this in sequence. But I think if we've got time, I would quite like to. Well, we put quite a lot of work into it, so it'd be a shame to hide the light under the bushel.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So right. So we're still going. Do you want to secure it? So sort of to summarise, I think what we've said in those slides about significant, but then also about the other stuff, is we've talked quite a lot about it's about the increase and the gain. So you can look at what the increase in the units is compared to pre-development, but that's not really just it. So when we were talking to LPAs and also to developer ecologists, they were really clear that actually it's not a number or a percentage. So you can't just say a number or a percentage, really, we don't think, from what and others agreed with us. It's like, in our local context, is this habitat important? Does it fit in with local biodiversity strategies? When the local nature recovery strategy comes in, where is it relative to that? Is it a habitat that we're trying to encourage? Exactly. And also what came out quite strongly from that conversation was around habitat condition and distinctiveness and how important that is. But I think what we realised through that conversation, Rich, was that this is not very easy to tell by quickly looking at the metric. And so you might need somebody to tell you it.
Well, there's also the way numbers work, isn't there? So if you start with 0.4 and you end up with 2.4, the percentage increase is huge.
Yeah.
The quantum increase is not. And I think you're not. So for that reason, you can't say, well, if it's 100% increase, it's automatically this, or if it's an increase of 3 units, it's automatically that, because those numbers behave differently if your starting point is very small or very big.
Exactly.
Therefore, you just have to. We're back to common sense, aren't we?
Yeah, and this is where it comes into whether how much you actually want to focus on that significant, because it may be that there are other reasons, like it's already amazing and you want to keep that. So yeah, so it is going to depend on your approach locally, but also that particular site and the context in its location. One of the other things that sort of came up in our discussions was actually there may be times when you don't want to say it's significant because, maybe it's a really amazing, so one thing we're hearing is that there's some projects that are being brought forward actually for conservation reasons that require planning permission, but people can't sign up for 30 years because they don't have the money. They've got money for the capital works or for 5 years. So, again, and this comes into, do we want a really kind of set definition of it? Perhaps we don't for those reasons. And, actually, perhaps it's quite good that it's up to you to decide, because you can bring in that flexibility and you can say, well, actually, in this case, it's a really good project. It's doing nature conservation. Let's not worry about the BNG bit so much. They can do the 10%, but we don't need to secure it for the 30 years.
Otherwise, we might scare people off.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, you've got that, like we said already, even if it's not a significant increase, you might want to secure it anyway. But I think there's two practical questions that we've sort of pulled out, but again, go into a bit more detail in the annex on this. Can you actually realistically secure it? Will you be able to enforce that? Will you be able to go and check and then enforce against either condition or Section 106? And is it worth doing? How much is the value of that habitat versus the time or effort of securing the gain? And obviously, if it's a Section 106, that's probably more time and effort. But yeah, we talk about that in a minute. But yeah, just really think about that. Is it worthwhile doing? And this is again why it comes into the number, where or the percentage, because actually, like you were saying, your example, yes, that's a massive percentage increase, but actually, do we want to bother to secure to do a Section 106 to secure 2.4 units? If you're in the middle of a big city, you might well want to do that. And that might be related to green infrastructure requirements rather than BNG.
And that enforcement point, is that the private gardens thing, or is there more to it than that?
Well, I think this is something that sort of Nick from Natural England's talked about a bit, is, there are definitely things that you can't enforce. So private gardens, you can't make people do stuff in their gardens, and things like container planting. But I think it goes beyond that. And, it's really thinking about, because you're going to need to do some checks if you're going to enforce it. And, so I think it's, it's just working out, I guess, and that comes into the type of development and what you're actually doing. What is it? What are you trying to do with this, and why? And what's it about? So there's a sort of slightly wider thing on that, I think. Okay, right. So okay, right, now we're deciding, right, you've decided you definitely want to secure it. Do you want to do that via conditional 106? Obviously, there's an option in the future of using a conservation covenant, but at the moment, as on this date, we've only got one responsible body, and they've said they're not going to do BNG, which is Natural England. So we don't have that option at the moment. So again, I think there's a sort of list of things to think about in terms of this. So I think what's quite interesting is, what do you want to secure? So for this significant increase, legally, you have to secure its maintenance for at least 30 years after development is completed. So what does that mean? What is habitat being maintained? So we talk about this a little bit more in the middle. But does that mean you want some reports on habitat monitoring reports? You want an ecologist to go out and have a look and see what they think is going, or see what they know is going on, I should say, not think. Right, if that's the case, have you got a schedule for those? What do you want them? Like year 1, year 2, year 5? Is there a lump? In which case, those probably will set that out. So, do you want those to be secured through your conditional Section 106? And do you want to check on those reports? Because it's all very well someone submitting a report, but then you've got to spend the time to check it, and probably you will need your ecologist to check it. So if you want to get some money back for doing that monitoring, you're going to have to use the Section 106. And you probably also want to have some set fees for that, because you're going to find it quite tricky if you suddenly just go, oh, finger in the air. Yeah, for my Section 106, I want to charge this amount. And we have got examples of, quite a lot of local authorities have thought about this. They've worked out how much they need, and they've got fees set for that. And I think the other thing is that is going to be really useful for any off-site BNG you need to secure as well, because you could basically use the same approach. And also, if you don't have the information on that at planning application stage, if you've got some set fees, you can use a condition to secure a later section 106, but that's going to be tricky if you don't have set fees, because basic developers not going to want to sign up to a condition to provide monitoring fees if they don't know what those fees are going to be. So yeah, so there are some pretty strong reasons for section 106. Another one is if a developer can, if they go above the 10%, they can sell their excess units if they want, or they could use them for another development. Now, to do that, they will need a section 106 because they'll need to put them on this national register.
National register, yeah.
Yeah, so you need to do that now because it's part of the development. So if they want to do that, they need to secure a section 106 now. And I guess another question is, well, are you doing a section 106 anyway? If so, it's probably quite easy to add BNG to it. If you're not, if you have to do it separately, then that's another thing. And that comes into all those questions on slide 6. You know, what's the balance of the habitat value versus the resource time costs of securing it, and how will enforcement work? So I guess if the other thing is, if you think, well, actually, I don't think I need a section 106, probably it's okay to do a condition, and you're not doing that because it's a significant gain, I think you need to think really, really carefully, because there's a BNG condition on anyway about getting the biodiversity gain plan. And obviously there's, you know, you have your general, you know, the condition you would usually had around development in accordance with approved plans. So what is the condition adding? What is it? And, you know, how are you going to enforce that? And I think it's worth thinking about whether you want to add a separate, you need to add, and there will be circumstances where you do, and that's fine, but just really think about that. And I guess the other thing is to say we're doing a bit of work around sort of sample section 106 and planning conditions. So hopefully have something on those very soon.
There are some points in this BNG world where I look at things and there's a real kind of culture clash. Because I guess things like this, like SANGs and things, like SANGs get monitored because this is where I'm slightly out of my zone of comfort, but I'm going to pretend I know. You can correct me, can't you? So SANGs, you know, you might have a project that's underway anyway, where everyone kind of agrees they're trying to improve the condition of a thing.
Yeah.
And it's probably got a friends of the thing, and they've got a role in making sure that everyone does the right thing. And, you know, it's got a life of its own.
Yeah.
Here, in theory, we're talking about a new housing estate, and somewhere in it there's going to be this thing, and it just feels like culturally, are we really going to turn up every 5 years for 30? Because that's not really how development management works, I have to say.
No, and I think it's going to you know, this is when you come into like the size of development, and we do have some really excellent examples of really big developments where they've provided amazing BNG, you know, but you know, and for those, yes, you probably would, but it may actually be, as we've said, the reason why those were secured was because of for green infrastructure, open space, you know, to basically allow residents access to nature. And that's totally, you know, that's not an invalid reason at all. That's great. But I think it's just, you know, bearing those sort of things in mind a bit, you know, and not being too fixed on. And I think this is about, you know, what we want to do is make sure this is integrated with the wider planning system, really, rather than being this separate thing, which it has an ability to become. Okay, so yeah, so I think this is where we've got a little bit of a question mark. So we've had a lot of conversations over the nearly 3 years that I've been involved in this project about monitoring and reporting, and that's the requirements on the developer or the landowner, whoever's doing the BNG and then maintaining it for 30 years, in terms of what do they need to monitor and then report to the LPA, but also in terms of what the LPA needs to monitor. Now, I can't find any mention of monitoring or reporting requirements in the Act. It talks about maintaining the habitat. So it specifically says to be maintained for at least 30 years. So I would think maintaining involves some kind of management, so that's fine. But does it require monitoring? And there's not very much in the guidance about this. So in the PPG, for example, it says some things about this could cover some management and maintenance to assist monitoring of gains. And also appropriately worded planning conditions and publications would also help. So not you've got to, it's kind of like, yeah, that might be quite nice.
But not only
But
that, but in that context, they're actually talking about preparing or updating your local enforcement plan, aren't they?
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, they are in that one, the first one, and then the second one is about the sort of conditions and planning obligations.
Hmm.
But they don't say, yeah, exactly what you've got to require there. But interestingly, the the DEFRA guidance on legal agreements, but this isn't just for on-site, this is also for off-site, it's just generally, does say you'll need to agree who's responsible for managing and monitoring the habitats. So we've got a question basically, which we have asked for views on, because we're still so. But again, I guess this comes into right. We can find out what's legally required and what's in the guidance, but you might want to go above and beyond that for all the reasons we've talked about already. Anyway, that may
Well,
be what you
there's
want to
that,
do.
but then there's also the point that we're not talking about, monitoring the performance of a roundabout. We're talking about natural things, and there might be floods, there might be
Yeah,
fires, there might be climate change, there might be whatever. It just feels a little bit like 30 years is a long time. I think
yeah,
it would be good, wouldn't it, to try to explore what's rational and sensible and
yeah,
proportionate to
yeah,
sort of build in at the outset, understanding that
yeah.
it's a big wobbly world out there.
Yeah, and that's obviously the point of having something like a LEMP or a hoop, just to kind of set out, because that should include contingency in there. If it all goes wrong and it doesn't work, what are you going to do? And that's the
Mm.
point of monitoring it. But again, you're not going to, really, are you going to really do that if you've got, a couple of street trees and you might be for other reasons, but that I think there's some questions there really.
Yes, because 15 years later, you're not going to get anyone on the hook going, remember you signed up to this thing and we've gone there and it's all
Yeah,
dead, and can
how
you
are you
start
actually
again
going to
now?
enforce it? Yeah.
Mm.
And for me, this is the big test about BNG and how it works and whether it's going to deliver, really. So, it'd be really nice to have some answers up front on this, but also some examples of how it's done. And I think that's where we're really struggling, because I've been looking for the last 3 years for good examples of doing this and making it work. And they're very few and far between,
Well,
in the long
hopefully,
term.
well, I mean, I think there is like a this little guilty secret about lumps, isn't there? So maybe this is
Yeah.
the chance to put in something that works better.
Yeah. I mean, I was kind of a little bit astounded to discover that, most of those don't require monitoring, and don't require any checks. It's just
Or indeed doing them at all.
no, no. So, so this is, and BNG is trying to change that, but it'll probably take time and for us to figure out how to do it.
Okay.
So to conclude, what do you want to do? Okay, I guess the first decision is, do you want to go beyond those minimum legal requirements? For example, by setting out what information you want in a local validation list. We think you probably do.
I think that's easy, but yes, but not
Yes.
too
Yeah.
prescriptively, I
Yeah,
think is the
exactly. Set it out, but
trick.
be a bit sort of vague. Um, and
Flexible.
as in, what are your intentions rather than definitively
Yes.
exactly this? What are you going to do if you don't get that information? What approach will you take? What approach are you going to take to deciding whether or not you want to secure the on-site BNG? How much do you just want to go, I'm only going to secure it if it's a significant gain, or do you want to think about other things?
I think it's fair to say, like, from our audience, they seem quite keen on securing and monitoring everything, don't they? I think
Yeah.
in a way that I think is slightly naive. I think like everyone just
Mm,
assumes Section 106 and monitoring money is good, but I think you'd have to be super confident to know that you're going to have enough left. Like,
mm,
year 1, year 2, that's all lovely jubbly. What about year 10, year 20?
yeah.
Is your council going to be good enough about keeping stuff back
Yeah.
to be able to still have money to deliver their end of the bargain?
Mm.
It could be, it's a liability.
Yeah, yeah. I think it'll be really interesting to see how it pans out. And I think this is where it comes into other things like, there's this sort of Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act, or NERC Act, as we like to call it, duty for local authorities just generally on biodiversity. And, how does that fit? So is this part of your general approach? And I think there's something about everyone realise that on-site stuff doesn't work very well. On-site green stuff, and actually even on-site non-green stuff, we don't tend to secure it very well. So this is a chance to sort of address some of that. So it's definitely worth giving it a go, because we know it
Mm.
doesn't work very well. So it'll, yeah, and let's try and find the best approach, but let's not be too kind of like black and white about it, because I don't think it is that black and white.
Well, and I've heard that Natural England are thinking about something that relates, ecology to design codes.
Yeah,
So you have a kind of sense of what sort of habitats and how do you kind
yeah,
of incorporate them into the fabric without putting
yeah.
everything behind a 9-foot fence.
Yeah, exactly. And there are definitely ways to do that. I've seen some excellent examples of, like, there's natural fencing, for example, if you don't want people on there, but there's also a lot of habitats that are actually quite resilient to people access, but you have to think about that. And yeah. Yeah, and then the last point is just, what are you actually securing? Are you securing monitoring? And do you want to use a Section 106 or a condition? And how is that going to work? Yeah, so that's kind of it. Do we want to flip through the
Let's
annex
have a
quickly?
little look at Appendix 2
Okay.
or Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. Come on, what have we got?
Okay, so in terms of,
This is just your crazy highlighting, is it?
yeah, as you can see, I'm an expert in highlighting in the straight manner. Look,
Well, look,
that
if
bit is
ecology
quite.
doesn't work out for you, you've always got a job
I know,
highlighting
I
things.
know, it's amazing. So this is what it says in the Environment Act. We've sort of covered that already. This is about this significant increase specifically. This
Mhm.
is what it says in the PPG. Kind of just repeats what it says in the um, Environment Act, but just sort of says that about this being an integral part of development, and also you can secure it via planning condition. Then there's some DEFRA guidance on this. Make on-site biodiversity gains as a developer, which goes into quite a bit of detail. It's quite useful. Doesn't always perhaps recognise that issue about the gain, which is where we got into a bit of confusion. But we've sort of highlighted some different things, and then you've
Again,
got some
versus the
things.
habitat itself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So then we did some thinking about it on the basis
Okay.
of that and had some help. And we were thinking about all the ecological stuff. So you've got the metric, which is really useful, but actually what we realise is you've got to dive quite into the metric to understand some of this. And even then, sometimes it doesn't really tell you very easily. And so, we sort of got to the stage where we were like, well, is it just about the number of units relative to what there was to start with? Because that's a proxy for habitat value, so surely that is the answer. But then when we started talking to people about it, it was like, oh, well, it's not, because the metric has these risk multipliers that actually reduce the value of some really important habitats because they're difficult to create. So it's like, ooh, it's probably not just the number or percentage increase. You've got to think something about distinctiveness. Oh, I've done something weird with my typing there, I've just noticed. Yeah, it has that habitat distinctiveness. It says distinctives there, or condition increased, but also could we get the developer to tell us this? And this was actually came from some developer ecologists who said, well, we could tell the local authority this, we could tell them whether we think it's significant. But also they were sort of pointing out that a lot of it's about that local context and where it is, that's the ecological importance. So we ought to factor those in. So it's not quite as simple as just going, right, we had
The
2
answer
to
is
start
3.
with, we've got 10. So that makes it more complicated, but also brings in this thing of, well, get the developers ecologist to look at it, because you can't realistically get your ecologist to look at every single planning application and decide whether it's significant BNG, because that's just not going to work.
No.
They haven't got enough time. But then there's this, because it's up to you, you can start thinking
And also,
about,
just to sort of pick up on that, I suppose
yeah,
the bit that I am realizing, I think, is the significance is a kind of means to an end, isn't it? It's not significant for significance sake. It's significant enough to secure for 30 years.
yeah,
So
yeah,
in a way, that's the really important question.
yeah. Yeah, and because it's up to the LPA and it specifically says that in the legislation, that kind of gives you that ability to be flexible and, to make decide case by case. So that's when we get into the sort of, it's not, it is about a significant increase, but significant brings in the planning considerations as well. So when we get into what we've talked about already is around, is it actually possible to enforce? You definitely can't do that for private gardens or container planting. And is it worth spending the time? Do you want to think about how much it might be in cash terms, you know, relative to how much time you're going to spend trying to sort that? So I think we kind of got to the way we would determine significant gain, which is it's the number of units compared to the pre-development baseline, factoring in habitat distinctiveness, condition, plus location and local context. But you should take into account whether it's practical, both possible, but also worth it to secure it because it's that 30 years. So that's kind of, yeah, what was our thinking about significant, drawing on other people's experience. But I think
that's why we kind of stepped back from just wanting to do
exactly
a significant podcast, because
yes,
when you say it like that in a big long list, it sounds really complicated, but actually, in a way, step back, use common sense. I quite like, when you talk to DM people, they know kind of, if you like, the value of an affordable housing unit. I'm not supposed to call them units, but I've stumbled a bit on what the word is these days. I think, I know it probably will annoy ecologists, but I think there is value in saying, if we had to go out and buy it from a national credit, thank you, and we'd have, starting from scratch, if it all went wrong, we'd have to go out and we'd buy it and it would be, £8,000. How much energy, effort, time is £8,000 of benefit really worth? And the answer is not a lot. And I think that's over time we are going to be able to kind of get a kind of fag packet version of how much energy and effort these things are really worth in a way that we have for lots of other different things. It's just that at the moment you talk to DM people and they can look out the window and kind of go, well, yeah, I can probably see someone putting 40, 50 units on that site. But what they can't really do is to look at a patch of ground and go, well, we could, generate so many units
biodiversity units.
Exactly. And that would have a cash equivalent value of what, and we just haven't internalized that yet, but we will.
Yeah, exactly. So so hopefully that is helpful, and sorry we don't have all the answers, but we'll get there, but hopefully that's useful. So I'm going to stop recording,
and we're going to say more to come.
Yes, so I think the main thing is we will update these as we go along and as we get more info. So we've obviously done the other session around sort of DM more generally in the scenarios, and we'll update those, but also we're looking at doing something specifically focused on planning committees and what they might need to know.
And maybe we can also revisit the basics of BNG at some point as well. I think that'd be quite useful.
Yeah, the BNG essentials, definitely. Yeah, because that's something that obviously you get into all this detail and it's a bit if you don't know where you're starting from. So
brilliant.
Excellent. All right, see you later.